Salar Abdoh's novel, Out of Mesopotamia, begins in Syria, with a man named Nassif hushing the narrator, Salah, just moments before they charge a house that had, not long ago, been held by fighters belonging to what was often called ISIS or Daesh. Salah is not a fighter, precisely, though he carries an AK-47, even in spite of the fact that he can only see clearly through one eye because he lost a contact lens. Salah is an Iranian journalist and writer, mostly getting by on art criticism and writing for TV, and he's not even supposed to be in Syria at all because the Iranian government wants to make sure they control the narrative of what's happening there, and Salah doesn't always toe the line. Nassif is also Iranian, and he's not supposed to be in Syria either. Nassif's masquerading as an Afghan mercenary because, in Abdoh's words, the Revolutionary Guards, who were in charge of all the logistics and combat operations, were not so keen on just any Iranian getting up to come way out here. There had to be some form of control. Salah believes Nassif has come to Syria to die, to become a martyr, to, quote, have a street or a traffic circle named after him. Why Salah is in Syria, why Salah himself is in Syria is not quite so simple, and the book gets more complicated from there. It's impossible to do justice to the rich, ambivalent, and intricate work of art that Salar has created with Out of Mesopotamia, since any attempt to outline its tangled plot, sketch its self-dramatizing and contradictory characters, or clarify its complex thematic concerns can only flatten and occlude what is, I think, its most incredible accomplishment, the representation in literary form of the lived experience of what we might call, following quantum physics, the many worlds problem. Of course, Abdoh has always been concerned with the complexities of crossing cultures, from his first novel, The Poet Game, published in the year 2000, which eerily and presciently followed an Iranian-American translator into a tangled terrorist conspiracy in New York, through his later novels Opium and Tehran Twilight. Out of Mesopotamia follows that concern through a specifically Middle Eastern valence, dramatizing the nuances of Persian and Arab interaction in a war largely fought between Sunni extremists and Shia militias, and in which American bombs, Iranian commandos, North African expatriates, and Afghan mercenaries all played important roles, never mind the Russians or the global media. But Abdoh's after even bigger fish in this novel, a journey through the existential and ontological multiplicity of war. In this journey, oddly enough, an annotated copy of Marcel's Proust's Remembrance of Things Past becomes a kind of Virgilian touchstone, a red thread connecting together the uncanny multiplicity of worlds that Abdoh brings together, which uncanniness is only made stranger by the sense of proximity fostered by smartphones, social media, and the relentless video record of violence uploaded to the internet and sent around the world as it happens, often alongside cat videos. Abdoh doesn't just bring together war and peace, the battlefield and the book launch, martyrdom and the mall, self-dramatizing fiction and the revelation of truth and action, myth and fact and Facebook and the bullshit that winds up on TV. No, he makes us feel how Salah lives in these disparate worlds all at once, and how, even more uncannily, not just because of the war, but because of the strange ways that memory works, he also lives at once in the world of the living and the world of the dead. One night near the front, quote, when the big guns aiming towards Syria would not give it a break, Salah sees something on TV, or perhaps in a dream. Quote, a story about a future world where survivors of some catastrophe live in a bubble and the heroine is mermaid-like and more beautiful than anything in the Arabian Nights. We were mesmerized. Just a few kilometers from the Satar, we sat watching the world of the beautiful. Their fictions broadcasting right into this broken room that the enemy almost managed to capture some months ago on their way to steal fuel they needed to get them to the capital of their fictitious empire down the road in Syria. I do not know how to translate any of this. I do not know in how many worlds a person can live simultaneously before they lose themselves completely. There's not language enough to explain all of this. Abdoh's incredible achievement in Out of Mesopotamia is nevertheless just what it accomplishes in language. Not explanation, but form. Not translation, but reality. Not fiction, but art. Salar Abdoh was born in Iran and splits his time between Tehran and New York City. He's the author of the novels Tehran at Twilight, The Poet Game, and Opium, and the editor of Tehran Noir. He teaches at the MFA program at the City College of New York and joins us today from Tehran, where it's about 3:30 in the morning. please join me in welcoming Salar Abdoh. So
thank you, Roy. Thank you for that amazing, truly amazing introduction. I'm humbled. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think if you would like to read, I guess that would be.
Sure. I'll read. I'll read a short section. The only word that you need to know here is the word mokeb, which in Arabic and basically in these places of war and or pilgrimage and other places, is a place that people go to sort of relax, get refreshments, get food. So a mokeb is a place that soldiers and fighters come to sort of get some time off before they go back to the front line. And this is where the main character of the novel Saleh hangs out at most of the time, serving the fighters. But there are different sorts of mokebs, particularly in this war, because this one is very close to the front lines, and the people who serve at it are not really rear guys, but they end up actually being engaged with the enemy. So, and then he also mentions a cleric J is just a cleric that he is there with, who sort of runs the show at this mokeb. And this is because in this war and in many of these situations, particularly Shiite clerics do play a big part. They're sort of fighting clerics, and they also encourage the fighters to do the things that they do. So I'll read a little bit from that. One night at the mokeb, while we prepared the morning breakfast for several men of the Ali Akbar brigade, who had asked for the favor of billeting them for a day or two, I dug into my notebook and recalled that I'd only copied one single line from the Frenchman. A book is a large cemetery where on most tombs one can no longer read the faded names. Now, as I write these words, I realize that there are so many lost names to a life that the best one can do is to simplify, to not fret the act of forgetting. The soldiers in a platoon might remember every tick and oddity that one of theirs carried, but a fellow in a mokeb is lucky to remember his own name after enough time has passed, let alone the names of the dead. One of them I'll remember, however, because the love we had was immediate, and he also happened to have the same name as the brigade we were hosting just then, Ali Akbar. He came in one day for tea, his hand-me-down shirt ridiculous and dangerous in its oversizedness for a crack sniper. He was rail-thin, and his buddies like him were Iranians, volunteer dead guys. I had not spoken a word of Persian in weeks, not even with the fighting cleric J, who had taken me under his wing and brought me way up here to the last true front line left in Iraq. Those of us who wanted to fight on would have to move west, crossing the obsolete border back into Syria, and pretend we were still defending the holy places. We all knew it was no longer about that. It was about something else, something elemental having to do with adrenaline and revenge. I imagine hunters know something about it. We had been chased and at times humiliated, but now the tables had turned. Watch a man whom you finally caught and whom you know has killed a few dozen people, mostly civilians, just because he could, because even as recently as 1 week ago he could afford to be judge and executioner, and because he's a piece of shit. Then examine his eyes as he does not even try to protest his innocence because he knows that you know. See the way he goes limp inside of himself. Observe him carefully while the gone insane among you and maybe the odd sadist turn up to beat the soles of this man's feet before they shoot him. And you'll also know never to dishonor a man beyond a certain edge. I don't know what that edge is, and I don't want to investigate too deeply. I just want to tell this story without the encumbrance of all the names that I have forgotten already, because they'll all die anyway. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So I would invite questions, conversation from everyone here. I've got questions about the book. Look forward to discussing it. And if you at any point want to read any more, just let us know. That was a great reading. I guess I would start with a question. I intended to mention in the in my introductory remarks that this isn't. It's not just a novel. I mean, it's more than a novel, but it's a novel from experience, right? You had this cushy job in New York. I don't know if it's cushy, but you have a good gig in New York teaching writing, and written several novels, but then you decided to go report on the war in Iraq, the conflict with ISIS. Why would you put your life in danger? What made you decide to go do that then at that point, to throw yourself into it? And you wrote about it. There's a couple pieces on Guernica where you write about it quite powerfully. There's great photographs as well of even of the fighters at the Mokeb, right, that you were just talking about, some of the people that you drew on for the novel. But so I guess the question is, so one, like, what made you decide to throw yourself into the conflict as a writer? And then why specifically turn it into a novel rather than I'll admit I hate this question when I get it, but I'll ask you anyway. Why turn it into a novel rather than a work of reportage, or even some kind of novelistic journalism?
They're both really good questions, Roy. There were several reasons I got involved in this war. I think the foremost reason was that, I've always, for a long time now, I've really lived between two worlds, the United States and here in the Middle East. So, and my family is here. I mean, I have family all over the world, but my closest people have been here as well. And so the war was very close to me when it began, and it was really it was an existential. This situation was truly an existential threat. The distances. Iran is a large country, but the distances are. We're talking about let's say the distance between Boston to Washington, D.C. These are not very, they're long enough, but not that far away. Mm-hmm. And I felt that the ISIS war, I don't have a better term for it, so I'll just call it that. it just and it's beyond probably the scope of what we're doing here. It was really like it brought together so many different things, and I could not, turn my eyes away from it, even though I was seeing in my milieu here in Tehran that everybody else did, all the people that I knew, writers, artists, filmmakers, except for the few, war correspondents and war documentarians and war photographers whom I hang out with, just I've always have, like everybody else was almost oblivious of this war, or made fun of it because of their own intellectual proclivities, thinking, oh, this is just some sort of a cooked up bullshit war that probably the Islamic Republic has some sort of a hand in as well, all of those conspiracy theories and stuff, things like that. So it wasn't like that for me at all. And because I'd been doing some work with people in the business, so to speak, the business of war, particularly one, my close friend of mine, a war documentarian, when this started, 2014, when Daesh, when ISIS sort of, it just made that blitz into, on Mosul and Tel Afar, we were in south. We came up through Najaf and Karbala and all those places, and that was the beginning of it for me, 2014. And then what happened was, as you know, in the Middle East, in let's say Mesopotamia, if you want to, if you're a person who wants to hang out or do some work, documentation with, let's say, with the Kurdish militias, it's very doable. They're very open to that, or some other, units. But the Hashd al-Shabi, the Shiite militias are a pretty close world. You can't just sort of. But us, because of the work we've been doing and contacts, so we were able to do that. And then I had been through my good friend and editor, I had been in contact with Sebastian Junger, and I highly respected the work he had done in Afghanistan with the Restrepo, and he and the production company, they were doing something for National Geographic. So in a way, what I was doing on my own came together with this National Geographic thing, which ended up being called Hell on Earth, The Fall of Syria. It was a long title. So I did a little bit of work for that, but then that was over, and I continued because the war was certainly not over. Yeah. And I continued to be there as the war moved. In Iraq, at least, it moved north as ISIS got pushed back, and it became a sort of a way of life for me. In a way, the way like I'm doing it right now. It's 3-4 a.m. in Tehran, and I'm talking to you. I was really in different universes, and I've talked about this before. And like in one of the essays that you mentioned, I talk about, like being at the front, and then maybe catching a plane from Erbil or Baghdad, going to JFK Airport in New York, catching a cab going directly to campus and teaching a creative writing graduate creative writing class, and that sort of it was a very strange thing to do, but in the grand scheme of things, and I'll talk about that in a minute, it wasn't so strange because of the things that one sees in modern war, as you've seen it, because with the social media and the way one can be in different universes at the same time, and the idea of simulation and reality versus virtuality. Like I was living, it was a very strange life, but at the same time, it seemed to fit the mold of the world we're living in today. It did, and it does still to this day. Can play havoc with your mental well-being. It's not an easy thing to do, and I've talked about this before. It's the hardest aspect of it is anger. I think anger at others who you think don't care or don't know what's going on and how close hell is. Or there's a part in the book where the narrator, he's gone because he's a part of the art milieu of this city, Tehran, and he's gone to an art show to do a review, and he says that he sees the theater people, and he talks about how they always shove Samuel Beckett down people's throats, and then he thinks about the fact that they have no idea. At least Beckett knew something about wastelands, having lived through it. But go to, and he mentions go to a town that's been absolutely devastated, and he mentions the town of Biji, which I'm sure you know, and and then he is resentful of these people, and he has to work through his anger, as I did. I admit this freely because it's a process that can and you have to come to terms with yourself and the world and realize that the world is a big place and many things are happening. There's a lot of white noise, and you can't if you allow yourself to fall into that resentment mode, you can pretty much lose it. So that's one thing was on the side, but so that's basically how it was a existential thing that affected me personally and my family because of some of ISIS's very specific goals vis-a-vis the Shiites in Iran, especially. But also, I was interested I had always been interested in war, and what the Iran-Iraq war was arguably one of the most devastating in history. 8 years of it. It was a war on the scale of World War I. The way numbers were dying, and I've had friends who I just talked to you about these vets who experienced Saddam's chemical weapons, and these are not easy things to see. And so it was a big part of being Iranian. If you pay attention to it, a lot of people don't. Why I chose to put all of this in fiction, as you did, is it was a choice. It was a choice that I had to wrestle with for a while. I started by thinking that I was going to write a nonfiction book. At some point, I thought, pretty good nonfiction is being written. There are people doing good work with journalism and such. But the life of mine that I described to you just now, a life over a period of maybe 5 years, was so absurd in a way. Not only war itself is absurd, the way it plays out, and war is so absurd in this 21st century with all the virtuality that I just talked about.
Yeah.
But my own life of forget about being in Iraq and then going to New York to teach. I mean, just going between Baghdad or wherever the front was and to Tehran, that in itself was an exercise in complete dissociation and strangeness, because I would come to Tehran and it was as if, the world is going, people are going to the art galleries, like all the things that Saleh in the book mentions. There are book parties, there's book readings, there's this, there's that, and he has this interrogator who interrogates him, and all of these things, and then the war itself, living in all these multiplicities of universes so close to each other. Yeah. At some point I thought, I really can't, I can't do this justice in a nonfiction book. Maybe somebody else can. I just can't do it. So I'm going to put it in fiction. And then when I began writing it, I thought I was going to write a very a serious book of war, novel of war with much gravitas.
Yeah.
And it just wasn't coming out like that at all. Yeah. It just, one day I was in Tehran and I sort of complained to a friend. I said, I'm trying to write a serious book and it's just not coming out very seriously. But it is serious, but it was also very humorous, because all of these strange situations that I was encountering. So I thought fiction was the only way that I could do my own life, at least, justice vis-a-vis everything that was happening in the Middle East at the time, and it's still happening.
Yeah, thanks. For me, some of the best or the most, I guess, affecting and honest, whatever that means, accounts of war in literature have that kind of humorous or absurdist, or there's just there's something, there's something sideways, right? There's just something, and especially maybe it feels like, especially the closer we get to the contemporary moment, sort of the less sense it makes to participate in this activity of mass murder, and also I don't know, social. It's also a way of forming a social cohesion, right? There's the camaraderie side. There's the meaningful, this is something I write a lot about. War isn't just an absurdity. It's also a way of making meaning, right? For humans, we've just been doing it that way for a long time. And this comes out in your book repeatedly, with your nuanced analyses, or Salah's nuanced analyses of a martyrdom and why people are there at the front. I want to take a moment before I go on to invite questions from from everyone else here on Zoom. You can just raise your hand and use the raise hand function, or put something in the chat. It'd be great to open up the conversation. Yeah, so there's the question of making meaning, and that you know, and I was especially struck by um, in the novel and what you were just talking about now, that sense of division of going from one world to another, and it feels so hard to it's so hard to describe because it's not just like in a different place, and it's not even just like in a different country. It's like it's a different, it's like you have to shift like your relationship to reality in some way, right? Like you go from a world where the landscape around you is alive and active, and has a potency that just isn't the same in peaceful existence back, you know, back from the front, or you know, back in the world. And then as well, like that doesn't just affect you and your phenomenological, your lived existential relationship to the world around you, but it affects everyone else around you, right? And it's that sense of like, you know, you people aren't paying attention. You're not being serious, right? Like if you're in a situation where decisions take on these stakes, these life or death stakes, and you see people who, you know, like your cleric, who, like, I mean, he's an absurd figure, but he's a heroic figure. He's figured out how to do this and do it well and ethically and take care of his people. And you see that, and then you go back to Saleh goes back to, you know, Tehran, and it's all this like infighting, you know, with the editors and you know, with his censor, and just it feels like there's all these little things going on, and he seems so he can't connect the like the stakes in the one world to the stakes in the other, right? Because they're just so disparate. And I think that inflects too the questions of representation that you bring up in the novel, particularly with you know, there's sort of this running not joke, but like running issue with Saleh like working on this TV show about the sniper, and his like running competition with I think it's Saed, the TV journalist, right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, there's these ways in which Saleh, you know, who spends in the novel like quite a lot of time in the front lines or at the Mokeb, taking care of frontline soldiers. There's quite a lot of time there. You know, he comes back and he sees these other people and is involved in, like, you know, just for money, you know, because he needs to, is involved in this like corruption or like misapprehension or like misunderstanding, you know, of the experience he has and sees around him. I guess I would just wonder if you might talk some about, you know, about where that came from, and sort of, I guess, what you think or how you think about different representations and approaches to war in you know, in these different media and these different forms.
Sure, absolutely. You know, when all of this began, obviously I was spending a lot of time with guys who they would not have been like, it would not have been a shoo-in that they would be my friends if I were just in Tehran here, because these guys are like real believers. They were selling the shirts off their back to go to Iraq and Syria to defend the holy places.
Yeah.
And most probably die, and die they would, many of them. I mean, what is that about? You know, that really is a mind-boggling thing in itself. And I found myself after a while wanting only their company and missing their company when I wasn't there in the war. And it was easy for me to come in and out of the war. You know, a lot of these guys, it wasn't easy for them because besides everything else, I mean, they had a commitment, but besides that, you know, they didn't, you know, they'd sold everything they had to be there. They couldn't just get on a plane and come back.
Right.
And I found myself, you know, I mean, others have talked about it, and in my essays I've talked about it. There really is a, you know, I know it's going to sound a bit of a cliche, but there really is a brotherhood in war, you know, that you just cannot experience it in peace. There's something about being with a bunch of people whose lives depend on each other, you know, in very, very difficult situations, filled with adrenaline you know, at any moment you cannot exist anymore, or they cannot exist. And you know, I've talked about, you know, you're having tea in the morning with your friend who has become your brother in a way, and that afternoon they no longer exist, and they no longer exist in the most violent way possible, you know, missing body parts. You know, they're not just one thing, they're like several body parts, and you have to deal with that. And then that scenario, which repeats itself over and over again in battle, and you lose people, and you sort of go on. You know, it's very different with American soldiers, the way it plays out, and let's say with that Shiite militias, for instance, because there is a sense of resignation with the latter that I'm not sure quite exists with let's say Americans. You would know better, but so that resignation itself is a fascinating thing to be a part of, and watch yourself becoming a part of that paradigm. Like, you cannot help but be like, you can't you know, the whole, yeah, that's a whole interesting thing. And then the issues of PTSD and all that is very different. Like, it plays out very differently. But like, so you're as an outsider like Saleh or me, you're watching all this.
Yeah.
You're not you know, you are sophisticated, you're well read, you know, there's a meta quality about your very presence where you are. You're watching yourself, watching the war, and the war is not even 2 kilometers away, it's around you.
Yeah.
You know, there are these, I forgot the word in English, these things that fly on their own. What are they called? The drones.
Drones, yeah.
You know, like, you know, I can, you know, how many times do you just sort of get up and start running because there's a drone coming? You don't know if it's yours, if it's a friendly, or if somebody else. Like, there's a ridiculousness in all of this. There's a drone, it looks like a toy, and it can kill you, and it does. And then you come back to Tehran, and for instance, you know, Saleh comes back to Tehran, and one of the people he has to deal with is this so-called poet who is also his boss at the journal, at the magazine. And the guy has figured out how to write peace poetry about, so that, you know, he can get invited to European book festivals and like be the peace poet of his country and get all sorts of awards. Or his documentarian partner can, you know, take Europeans around in Iraq, and, you know, they can make their weekend videos about war, or, you know, he thinks about these things, like, you know, his friends in Syria and Iraq are dying or have died, where these guys are collecting prizes because they're writing their damn peace poems or weekend documentaries, you know, about war. And he's an angry guy. And all of that, I mean, because he writes, you know, art reviews, and he's part of, and he knows it, as you mentioned, he knows that he's a part of an industry, the art industry, which in the Middle East is very strong, because especially in the Gulf, you know, there's a lot of money moves in the art market. Yeah. And a lot of dirty money moves through the art market. And he talks about how, you know, he'll be in the Gulf, in Dubai or somewhere, and, you know, he'll be doing you know, there'll be an auction, and the same people who are buying these artworks, which usually they're just crap pieces of whatever, but then in the next hour in another room, they'll, you know, one of them will be supporting, you know, putting money into Yemen or Syria or Iraq or some other place, and then another one will be doing the same thing but for the opposing side. So Saleh realizes he's just cog in the wheel of corruption that encompasses everything. It encompasses art, it encompasses literature, like nothing is sacred. And then at some point he says, you know, he's somewhere in northern Iraq, and he's sort of talking to himself, and he says, you know, a couple of years from now, these landscapes, where if you take one wrong turn, you know, your head will be chopped off. You know, tourists will be walking down here, and they'll be taking selfies of this is where this happened. And, you know, and then he talks about, you know, how even combat, the last sacred thing, has also become a sort of a virtual reality simulation, even as it's happening. And he talks about how, and these are all, as you know, this is so true, and it's so absurd, and also so sad. You know, like these guys who. I can't tell you how many times it happened to me, like on Facebook. Facebook is real pretty big in places like Iraq. Yeah. You know, like, you know, guys will be posting something, and then literally a few minutes later, they'll be dead while their post is just starting to make the rounds. Yeah. You know, and like he realizes, as you have, that, you know, nothing is sacred. He has a very hard time with him being a writer, because yes, he writes for television, you know, so he has to create this heroic character, and then because state TV wants it, and his state handler, his interrogator wants it, and then he has to cover these art shows, and then he has to go to war, and like he realizes all of it is BS. There's nothing sacred. There's nothing honorable in anything, and the only honorable thing that the things I'm saying now, I think I'm kind of figuring it out as I'm telling you. I think the only honorable thing that he can find is not to sell himself out too completely. Yes, he may write for state TV for bread. Yes, he may cover these art shows, but there's some work in the core of him being with his brothers, his comrades in battle, and being witness and not losing sight of that. And not, it would probably be easy for him. It would be easy for me. I could write a couple of peace poems any day. I could, with my experiences, and post them, and but he wants to unconsciously probably keep an honorable core.
Yeah.
And that, as I was writing this, it's interesting. As I was writing this, I thought, I've read a lot of American art writers such as yourself and others, and I was conscious of it. I thought, there'll be different readers for this book, but I think one group of people who will really get what I'm trying to do here are the guys who are veterans and writers, such as yourself, such as Phil Clay, Kevin Powers, these people, Elliot Ackerman, because they've sort of seen what I've seen, they've done, but from the other side of the lens, so to speak. But I was conscious of that. It didn't get past me because I've read what I've read. I know what I know. So I'll stop there and let you ask the next question.
Well, I guess so. I mean, one question I would have, going off what you just said, is it a lot of American war literature is very sort of self-aware about its tradition, especially more recent stuff. Like Red Badge of Courage to Hemingway to Tim O'Brien, and it's clear and Out of Mesopotamia that you've, like, as you just said, like, you read it and you've thought about it. But there's also, like, the self-reflexiveness of that American tradition. There's still, like, this consistent sort of, it's almost like spiritual literature, a tradition of spiritual literature in a way, and that it's sort of, there's a motivating idea behind a lot of it that that war is this transcendental experience, right? And I've written about this in some of my nonfiction, my scholarly work, and a lot of the American literary tradition. I mean, there's different, there's divergent and resistant strains, Stephen Wright or Kurt Vonnegut. But, like, there's this sort of persistent, even with it, even looking at it as like this horrible thing, this traumatic thing, it still winds up being this kind of like transcendental spiritual encounter. And it's complicated because the experience of war is so powerful and visceral, and has these elements to it, like the camaraderie and the encounter with death, and the uncanniness of it that lends it to this kind of spiritual interpretation. But I think one of the things that I really appreciated about your novel is that it doesn't do that, right? Like, perhaps because many of the people involved, like many of the fighters involved, like see they already have a kind of I guess there's already a spiritual context for the experience of war there, but also with with Salah, who's not, who is sophisticated and modern and urban and cosmopolitan. What you've just been saying really strikes a chord with the way I've been thinking about the book, is that it really seems like he's, and this is part of what makes the narrative so complex, is that he's working to stay true to himself in a way, right? Or that doesn't feel adequate, but like, I don't know. It doesn't feel like, within the context of the novel, he's gone to like uncover some profound truth about the universe or existence or what have you. I guess in some way he finds himself already thrown into the war and navigating this disruption back and forth, and crossing the border back and forth. And the novel really seems to be about like navigating that bifurcation, or that those two worlds, many worlds, right? With a sense of integrity. Like, how do you make ethical choices or stay true to yourself, trying to navigate between these two realities, these two value systems? It's not really a question, but I could invite you to talk on that, or I could sort of frame a question in a slightly different way. It's just what you were just saying, like, I don't know, just shifting the thinking of the novel. One thing that does, and I mentioned this in the and I'll probably do a couple more questions, and then we'll sort of work on wrapping things up. One thing that I mentioned is this annotated copy of Remembrance of Things Past, and the sort of the role it plays in the novel, and not precisely a MacGuffin, but like really this is much more sort of like connecting device, right? And it winds up being this like connection between Salah and his handler, his interrogator, and it's this recurring element, and then it sort of manifests in I can't remember his. I have to get the book. The name of Proust. I can't remember his actual name, but the Iranian literature student who like wound up at the front and left the book there, who is a like semi-comical figure, but like has this sort of tragic weight to him, right, as toward the end of the book. And I guess I would just so I don't know, I invite you to what were you I feel like I have a good sense of, or some sense of what you're doing there, but could you say like why Proust, and then why Proust like reemergent as this this Iranian literature student, and how do you see that? Most people don't think of Proust as war literature, although the First World War was an important event then in his life, and I shouldn't say much about Proust because I don't actually know much about him, but there's that book plays a central role in Out of Mesopotamia. So could you talk about that some?
Sure, absolutely. Proust, because Proust pretty much covers all of life. You know, at some point he's going to touch in that vast book something that covers. He covers everything, and he definitely covers war. And I quote from him. I think maybe not, but like in one of the probably, if I'm not remember correctly, when we were getting ready to send the book out, and my editor Ibrahim asked me to write something. I quoted Proust from the book, Remembrance of In Search of Lost Time, or Remembrance of Things Past, where Proust talks about, the character talks about the veterans. This is World War One. The veterans that come back for on leave from the front, and sort of and they walking, you know, standing outside of the cafes of Paris, watching cafe society going on about its business. And they're just sort of looking up into these windows. And Proust talks about maybe it's better that these vets don't get leaves, because there's something really sad and heartbreaking in the divide between where they are and where that cafe society is. That really struck a chord with me. It actually almost killed me, because it's so true.
Yeah.
And I thought, you know, Proust, as always, he got something. He went to the depth of something and he got it. Yeah. And I was, you know, I've talked about this. I really felt like those veterans of World War One coming home back on leave from Paris sometimes, even when I was sitting with Cafe Society in Tehran. Tehran is filled with cafes. You can get great cappuccinos here. And, you know, I was sitting, and I felt like a complete alien sitting with my own friends. And so Proust, because Proust talks about war at length, you know, he talks about many things, but also war, because there was World War One. Yeah. Also, as you know, war is a strange thing. You know, it's there's so much downtime and just downright boredom. Like, you get bored to death. You know, you're wishing something would happen. Somebody would try to kill you, for God's sake, so you can do something. Right. And, you know, at some point I thought, you know, I just gotta like bring some reading material, you know, and the bigger the book, the better. Yeah. You know, and then you end up not really reading, because, you know, there's never good light, you know, whatever. Right. You know, but you know, it's good to think that you might have it there if possible. And, you know, so I'd always, you know, since my mid-20s, you know, I had my complete volume of the old translation. Mm-hmm. And I brought it to Tehran with me back in the day. And it ended up in my friend's house with all of my other books that I brought to Tehran after I finished college in California. And so I wanted that sort of that connecting tissue, which was Proust. And so I knew that I had underlined many, many pages of Proust back in my 20s. And I called my friend and I said, Ali, can you take a photo of all the pages where you see underlines and send them to me on WhatsApp? Yeah. And he did. And there were many pages. And I used those in the places where the interrogator and Saleh, you know, go back and forth quoting Proust. I mean, and but it was because of that. I could have used, you know, Saleh quotes from Hemingway. You know, he reverses, you know, Hemingway in that great short story. The character says, in, I don't know, in winter or autumn, something like that. The war was everywhere, but we were not going to it anymore. And at some point, Saleh says, quite consciously, he says, in autumn, the peace was everywhere, but I was not going to it anymore. You know, he's very aware. He quotes Tim O'Brien, saying that, you know, you can always tell a war story if you just keep on telling it. Yeah. But at the end of the day, for me, it was the vastness that is Proust. I thought I could really mine that book because as we talked about it, I ended up, you know, the absurdities of writing about war, the absurdities of life and war, but also I didn't want to create some. The character was close to myself, somebody who's read a lot of books, you know, like I didn't change a lot of things, you know, the character of Saleh, I didn't on purpose, I didn't even change the name too much, you know, just a couple of letters. Right. And, you know, he lives across a synagogue in Tehran. And, you know, if you look out my window, there's a synagogue in Tehran, you know, like I decided very purposefully, I'm not going to change a lot. Why should I? You know, this is my life. And, you know, and then Proust, you know, because I love Proust and there's a lot of truth in what he had to say. And then that character of that young man who Saleh starts calling Proust because he's the person. That young man takes the book originally to Iraq and leaves it there because, you know, he gets lost during one of the battles. That young man is emblematic of many people here in Iran and greater Middle East, you know, people who, you know, who have ambitions, who really, you know, love literature. They want to, you know, but there are not many doors open to them, you know. And Saleh talks about, you know, we'll just call him Proust for our matter here. You know, he says this young man, you know, he's gone to school all these years, read, he learned languages, English, French, blah blah, you know, and he's the type of young guy who, you know, thinks about Hemingway and bullfighting in Spain, and thinks about, you know, Wittgenstein's Vienna and, you know, Gertrude Stein in Paris in the 20s. But at the end of the day, people like him in a place like this, you know, they end up, you know, killing themselves in one form or another, maybe not literally, but, you know, figuratively. And, you know, that young man is emblematic of so many people I see here all the time. And Saleh, the narrator himself, is also a part of that, but he teaches at the university here, like I do. And, you know, he talks about, you know, how he wants to teach his students about high seriousness, quoting, I think, Matthew Arnold, 19th century British writer. But all of it sort of comes out strangely because of the war and the corruption of everyday life. And so Proust becomes this sort of constant throughout the book around which all of the strangeness, you know, takes place, to the extent that Saleh's own interrogator starts quoting Proust back to him because he becomes obsessed with the book. Right. So.
Yeah. That was one of my favorite things that you did with it, the way that the interrogator sort of becomes obsessed and will send Saleh these like texts while Saleh's in the middle of, you know, whatever in Iraq. He'll get this line of Proust on his phone. I thought that was brilliant. Well, I fear that we could go on all night. I wanted to ask one last question, and then, you know, being mindful that it's, you know, for something there. and this is sort of quoting, I want to start with something you wrote, an essay you wrote about, about your book, Tehran at Twilight, I think for Akashic. But anyway, what you wrote was, I've always been struck by how easily people allow themselves to take the high moral ground when they've never, for example, lived in the vicinity of war or witnessed periods of intense upheaval, such as a violent revolution. It's too easy to be an armchair ethicist and see the world as either entirely black or white. What am I to feel for some 20-year-old Marine kid from middle America thrown into the nightmare of a battlefield like Fallujah, who must make split-second decisions about pulling the trigger or not? At the same time, what are my feelings about a man who watches from the distance as his entire family is mistakenly obliterated by an American drone plane and so decides to take up guns against the Goliath? These are questions that I wrestle with every day because I believe it is my job to do so. As a writer, as a person from the Middle East, as a passport-carrying American, as a professor in a public college in Harlem, New York City, where most of my students are working-class minority and immigrant kids, and a few of them war veterans. I believe that a writer must, if he's true to his craft, cut through the artificiality of the world, even if he uses artifice to hold a mirror to a culture that constantly strives to deceive us. Of course, I mean, I think that's very much, it seems like that's very much what you're doing with Out of Mesopotamia. And it reminds me of this famous line from James Baldwin, right? That the purpose of art is to lay bare the questions hidden by the answers. And I just wanted to ask you, it's sort of like a closing question. We're in a strange and confused time, transitional time. But I wanted to ask if you can talk about some of the questions. I guess this is a way of asking, it's one way it could go is, what are you working on now? But I'm not really asking just that. I'm asking what questions do you feel that you must wrestle with, what writers must wrestle with today? And perhaps even to merge your own words with Baldwin's, the questions that are hidden by answers that continue to deceive us.
Thank you for reading that text I had written about Tehran at Twilight. As an Iranian, I can, sitting here, I was talking to you just before we began how hard things are here, medicine is in the black market. I'm trying to find meds for my friends, people are needlessly dying from COVID. The American sanctions are really exacerbating this. It's so easy to just get caught up in the blame game and the hating the other. Making a monster of the other, and it's done all the time. I think like Saleh, I would like to think in the book, or in the main character in Tehran at Twilight, where one of the plot lines of the book is the friendship that develops between the main character, who is Iranian, and a former Marine captain who had fought in Fallujah, led his troops in Fallujah. So I'm always interested in sort of, obviously cutting through the morass to find out what really is at stake. I don't want to be writing bullshit peace poems and get prizes for them. I respect poetry, but I want it to be true. If you ask me what truth is in vis-a-vis poetry, I wouldn't be able to tell you right now, but I know it when I see it. I know it when I read it. And it's going to be hard for me to answer. This is the fundamental question of our time, I think. But like somebody in my situation, especially like being Iranian, but also being American in a way, being in two worlds, I think my specific job in life is to not make political politics does the issue out of the writings I do, but I don't set out to do political art. It just sort of naturally happens amongst other things. But my job is to sort of see the truth where it lies, and then talk about it, whether it's in essays or novels. I'm a professor, as you just read, in Harlem. My students, almost all of them, are working class, immigrant kids, Black, Hispanic. Therefore, many of them, not many, but sizable number, probably more than in private universities, have, through the years been in the armed forces of the United States, many of them combat veterans. I've had to deal with that. I've had to, and in Tehran at Twilight, the main character talks about, he's a professor like me in an institution in Harlem. Again, that book also is very close to me, but a very different book than this one. I have to deal with the reality of living in that world. Now I'm in Tehran talking to you, but next week or next month I could be in America, and I have to deal with the people I deal with every day, and sort of help them find. Help them transcend the hardships of everyday life that we experience. One reason a lot of these fighters here in Iran were going to the front in Iraq and Syria is because everyday life is really hard. Honestly, if you were to ask me today, everyday life is harder than war for me. And Saleh talks about that. He talks about, when you're in the field, everything is thought for you. You don't have to think about procuring food or this. This is what it is. Yeah. Everyday life, you have to, you have to think about paying your bills, doing that, taking care of your kid. It's like 10,000 things, and sometimes a person, a man or a woman, just doesn't want that, just wants to go and be in battle or whatever. And everyday life in America, honestly, is really, really difficult. The everyday chores of life in American society are unbelievably difficult. I don't know why that is, but it is that way. And I deal with it every day as a professor of writing in New York, in a place like New York City, in a public institution where that's the background of my students. And as Baldwin said, and as you beautifully talked about it, the truth lies for me, in discovering the humanity of people in the most challenging of situations. So, for instance, when my graduate students want to teach, we give them classes to teach undergrad composition or whatever, and they're scared and they've never taught before, and they say, Professor, how do I do this? And I always tell them, the first and last lesson about teaching is to be human. Don't forget these kids that you're going to be teaching are human beings, and they have hard lives. They're working class. They probably have night shift jobs. They come to your 8 o'clock morning class, and probably a mother of two falls asleep. Instead of immediately blaming them for not being awake in class or blah blah, try to understand who they are and what is making them, putting them in that scenario. If you expand that into the world we live in, it's the same thing. Try to understand how it feels to be in Tehran right now, where 400 people are dying from COVID. We can't get ventilators because of the economic sanctions. I have friends. My friend wrote an essay lately and published. I edited and translated it in the U.S. She talks about, like, I'm a 44-year-old woman, in my lifetime, even if I have to, get a hotel room in a European city, forget about the visa and all that. I have to go through like 55 different hoops because of sanctions, so that I can get a hotel room. And at the end of it, probably I can't. So like if we, my job here in Tehran and in New York and elsewhere is to sort of, I guess there's truth in being a bridge. Bridges are a good thing. They're good in war and they're good in peace. And I think I'll leave it at that, the answer. I don't know if I answered you completely, but I think being human is a really, really good thing. And we don't experience it often. When you experience it in war, it's really beautiful. In peace, it's a little more subtle, and you have to sometimes look for it. But when you find it, it's what makes life worth living.
Well, I don't know what to say to that besides thank you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for your writing. Thank you for thank you for what you just said, and thank you for coming, for staying up and Zooming here to come talk to us tonight. It's been it's been a great conversation, and it's difficult to put into words. I don't talk about the war stuff so much anymore, because I was a long time ago for me, and I work more on climate change now, which is horrible, but in different ways. And I just want you to know that it means a lot that to have you here and to talk with you about your book. And I know for myself, and I'm sure I speak for everyone else here tonight, we're grateful for you coming, and for whatever it's worth, we really hope that there's a way through the situation. Hope that we can do what we can. Hope that we can all build bridges, and hope that maybe there's this, in the bigger picture, and in more specific personal ways, that we can be active in doing that. So no, that wasn't nearly as eloquent as you, but I don't know, just thank you. Thank you, Salar. So
thank you. I consider you my brother, and I'm humbled and honored to be with you tonight. Fantastic. Thank you all. I hope, Roy, we can always be in touch. Truly, I consider you a brother, not just because of your war work, but I've read other things by you, and like what you do is exactly what I just discussed in my answering my last question. You really are that bridge of truth, and I appreciate that, and I always look for that. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.